You're probably wondering, well, what happens if I try to output an object into my element?
This video is brought to you by Appy Academy.
And let's check that out. So let's first create the object. And again, we're going to do it within a JSON type format. So the curly brackets. And then within here, we're going to set up our object. So do the first name, then the value that's associated with it. Comma separate to add additional items here. And then colon. And then do a last name. And then lastly, let's do a number. So do age. So if we want to output it into the element area, and we do the my object, we do message, text, content, and just equal that to my object. And refresh, and we get this thing that says object, object. So that means that we can't naturally output an object, and it's not going to be able to be something that we can easily read within the element. So because it's not a string, and it's expecting a string value. So there is a quick way, and with JavaScript, to turn an object into a string, and we can then output it as a string item within the element. So let's do the conversion, and we'll create another variable. We'll call this val, and then using a method called Json and Json Stringify. So JSON, it tells you a little bit more about what JSON is, and Stringify converts a value to JSON, optionally replacing values if a replacer function is specified, or option including only. So what this is going to be doing is it's going to turn an object into a JSON string value that we're going to be able to read and use. So using Stringify, and then pass in the object. And now instead of the object, we're going to output val. And we refresh, and we do get a JSON object. And the interesting thing about this is that, so let me update this and update it as a JavaScript object. And you see that Json Stringify even turns the JavaScript object into JSON format. So that's important to remember, because when you are trying to use JSON, you can easily convert those JavaScript objects into JSON and into valid JSON format by using the Json Stringify. So what happens now if you've got a string value? So if you've read a file and you're just getting the string back value of the JSON object, and you want to convert this back into usable object format in your JavaScript coding. So let's take our, we'll call it the my string, and then paste that. And actually, I'm going to single quote around that so that I can keep the double quotes included there. So now my string is going to represent the JSON object, but it's not within an object format because we're not able to pull out the contents of it. So if I refresh, and if I take my string value, this is just one string. So there's no my string first or anything like that. So it's going to come back undefined because this is just a string value. And you can see it being represented red within the console. So in order to break it back into usable object format, let's create another variable. We'll call that val1. And then using Json Parse, which does essentially the opposite of what we had with the Stringify, where it would take the string value and it turns it into an object. So now if I do console log val1 and we output it and refresh it, this is going to be back in an object format. And that means that we can also update it. So if we had val1 and we want to update the age to 41, console log val1 and refresh, now we've got an updated version for the age. And then once we're finished making the updates with our code, we can always turn it back into a string value. And doing that with the Stringify value. So let's create one last one. So this could be val2. And in this case, we're going to turn this back into a string value. So Stringify, and passing in val2 in there, or this should be actually val1. So now we've passing in that updated object value. And if we console log out val2, we're going to have that updated value as a JSON string. And that means that we can save it or we can transfer it, and this is going to be just one string value that's going to be transferred. And it can get broken up back into a usable object format and update it if we need to. Create an object, turn it into a string, and then take the string output, turn it back into an object, update some of the values, and then turn it back into a string, and you're going to be ready to move on to the next lesson.